Well, that guy just proved it by
Let the market decide.
towing
Towing
across
his-
country.
Yeah.
You know, every 100 miles you have to stop and recharge.
Let the market
Well,
decide.
yeah, the recharging's not that big a deal. I can have my car charged with a DC fast charger in 15 minutes. Time it takes you to go to a restaurant.
To full charge.
Well, 80%.
Okay.
Full charge. I got less than 5 minutes. I can have my tank at full.
Yes.
I'm a big proponent of all those things.
But
Anyway,
you had to go to the gas station. Of course, I had to go there, but anyway.
Well, you have to go to the liquor station, so it's.
we're ready to start.
There's
This
a
is
difference.
This is the Adult One Bible Study. My name is Norm Ellis, and this is Grace Baptist Church. So if you've tuned in online, hi, glad to see you. We're going to be starting here. And if you have your Bibles, turn to 2 Kings chapter 5. That's what we're going to be in today, 2 Kings chapter 5. And the title is God Heals. And this is one of those great stories from the Old Testament, this great account of one of the miracles, basically, that God allowed Elisha to do. And it's one again, I have several favorites, but this is one of my favorites. I just love this one. And the irony within this healing and how it happens and all that stuff is really interesting. And the change we see over this man is really striking. But we're going to be looking at how God offers compassion to people who follow His commands. And by the way, He offers compassion to all people, not just the children of Israel. We're going to see here, and not just the saved, but He offers compassion to all people. And so to keep that in mind as we go through this study today, I think it's really interesting. We're looking at these four areas of 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 through 6 is going to be called desperate. This person we're going to talk about today is desperate. And the second point is directed. This is 7 through 10. And the third is disappointment, or disappointed. And this is verses 11 through 12. And the last section, number 4, will be delivered. And that's verses 13 through 14. So let's all begin with a prayer, and then we'll start. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you again for this beautiful day. And Lord, I just thank you for giving us all that blessing of another day in our life. Life is precious. And as we see in our study today, when things aren't going good in our own lives, we do get desperate, Lord. Just pray for those people that are sick and that are away from us right now. Be with those that are on their way here. Keep them safe as they travel, Lord. And Lord, just pray that you bless this Bible study today and the ones that are going on in our church today as we go through these verses. And also pray for our upcoming message by our Pastor Matthew. And thank you for all that you've done. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. If it's a little noisy in there, Ron, in the hallway, Ron, you can close the door, I think. People will come in anyway. Here, we'll be keeping them out or anything like that. Anyway, so God heals. God heals. And if you're following along in the lesson, we're in session number 8, and that begins on page 73. So I'll give you some insight there. And this story is a story of a man named Naaman. Does that sound familiar, that name, Naaman? It should, if you know anything about some of the Old Testament stories. It's quite a dramatic story. It's quite interesting. But before we jump into it, let's have a couple of things to get us thinking here. A couple of questions. What might be some common medical advice that doctors give people?
Stop smoking.
Stop smoking. All right, that's a good one. I know one. Lose weight. Or some people gain weight, right? What else? Any other advice?
Maybe change your diet. Lower your cholesterol.
Yes. We want to do those things that'll help our body, right? An apple a day. The doctor says, right? No, he doesn't. That's one of those common myth saying things. But nothing's wrong with eating a healthy diet. We know that too, right? So what are the most common medical advice though that people ignore? People ignore.
All of the above.
All the things we just said, right? Sometimes it happens, right? I have known people who've smoked, and they knew they should stop, and they just did not stop. They could not stop, and they ended up getting, cancer, lung cancer, emphysema, different things, and they shorten their lives by doing that. So, medical advice is not to be ignored. So, what excuse, though, might a person give for ignoring that doctor's advice? What do you think? What's a good excuse? I didn't say reason. I said excuse. For me, but I just love to eat.
I feel fine.
I feel fine right now, yeah. They're not looking long range, right? Yeah. That's something I'm going to do tomorrow. That's the big one, right? Tomorrow.
I'm on it, Doc.
What's that?
I'm on it, Doc.
Yeah, that's right.
1 year later.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I tell the dental hygienist. Yeah. Tomorrow I'm going to start flossing every day, I promise. Anyway, so sometimes we come up with a kind of creative excuses. We're trying to fool who? Not really the doctor, right? We're trying to fool ourselves sometimes, right? Because we know we should be doing these things, but we're not. So we're trying to find some way to get us out because it's hard to do. It's not fun, or whatever the case might be. So today we're going to turn our attention to Elisha. Elisha, who is Elisha? Who is Elisha? First of all, what was his office?
Elisha,
Yeah,
prophet.
he was a prophet. Exactly, he was a prophet. And of course, it speaks of Elisha. We know in 2 Kings, but there's a little bit in 1 Kings. If you remember the showdown at Mount Carmel that we talked about last time. Not last time. One of the times before. What happened right after that showdown where the 450 prophets of Baal were killed and fire came down and consumed the sacrifice of the Lord and nothing happened to Baal's sacrifice? What happened after that to Elijah, we should say? He got scared by a woman, didn't he? Remember Jezebel? Yeah? Jezebel says, by this time tomorrow you're going to be dead. You're going to be dead meat, right? So Elijah got scared and he ran for his life, right? And he ran, he said, I'm the only one left, and poor me, woe is me, and an angel helped him, and God spoke to him through the angel the first time, and then the second time God spoke to him in a personal way, saying, no, you're not alone. You're not alone, As a matter of fact, I have a job for you to do. I have a job for you to do. And that job entailed him doing what? Remember what he did? I know it's here somewhere. Yeah, here it is. It says, go and return your way to Damascus, and when you have arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram. And Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint as king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Edel Mehelah, you shall appoint as prophet in your place. So Elisha received the mantle. Remember that? We talked about the mantle. That's this symbol of authority. And he asked only one thing. I want a double portion of what Elijah's got. So think about the power that Elijah had, right? And Elisha now has double that. That's kind of an interesting thing. And also, king of Aram. Where's Aram? He anointed somebody. He went up and anointed a pagan king as king over the northern area of Aram, whatever you pronounce it, which was just north of Israel. Now, what did Aram like to do to Israel? They liked to invade him. It was one of their favorite pastimes. What do we do today? Well, let's invade Israel, take some more of their places, right? So, but he went up there and he anointed this king, King Hazael. And so that was an interesting side job here. So we know now who Elisha is, though. Elisha is a protege of Elijah. And he received that mantle, right? But for a while there at least, Elijah, by the way, is in 2 Kings. So if you were to read 2 Kings up through chapter 2, through chapter 2, I think it is, we see Elijah and Elisha together. And then something interesting happens in chapter 2 to Elijah. What was that? Remember we talked about that a little bit. Did he die?
Yes, and Elijah stayed with him
Yeah, he stayed with
to receive the double portion.
Right. He was like his protege. But in chapter 2 of 2 Kings, something important happened. Elijah was taken away into heaven. He's one of the 2 people in the Bible that did not see death, that God took. Right? Enoch being the first one. We see that in Genesis, I believe. And Elijah the second one. It's an interesting little trivia thing there. So he was taken up by whirlwind. Some people say flaming chariots, but a flaming chariot came down there, but it says he was taken up by a whirlwind, which might have been the same idea. We don't know exactly. So Elijah is gone. But he left something behind. He left his mantle, and that mantle fell upon Elisha. Right? Elisha picked it up and put it on, because he was the one to step into his shoes. So now 2 Kings begins. And after that part, most people believe, because Elijah was 1 Kings and a little bit of 2 Kings, and Elisha began on chapter 2 and goes through the rest until the exile happens. And so what we see is these 2 mighty prophets are standing in the gap at this moment before Israel and Judah fall. So their job is to do what, do you think? Same thing a guy does who's standing at an intersection when there's a bridge out down the road and he sees somebody coming. What's he going to say to that person? Watch out! Right? He's going to be warning him. He's going to give that person advice. Don't go down that road. We talked about doctors and why we ignore advice, right? Israel was given advice after advice after advice, right, by the prophets. And Elijah and Elisha were 2 of the primary ones here, in Israel especially, the northern part. And they were warning the nation, watch out, take our advice, turn back to God, right? Tear down those idols. And so that's what their job was. And they did many miraculous things here. And this is one of them we're going to talk about today in chapter 5. This is like what I said. One of the goodies. I like looking at these because what do you think these miracles do? Miracles are a specific reason. We're given a miracle to show God's power, right? And to have God's approval on something, right? So this miracle is showing this person something. So we got to get our cast of characters here, and I forgot to do that. But we know who Elisha is. The other character is Naaman. Who is Naaman? Remember who Naaman is?
He was a commander of the troops.
Yes. He was the man that, the kingdom of Aram. Interesting. The connection there is amazing, isn't it? Remember what Elijah did? He appointed one of the kings of Aram. Now, it doesn't say here who that king was, I don't think, at this point. I was looking to see. But it could have been Hazael. It could have been somebody who just followed him. We don't know. But it's interesting that Elijah was involved with picking this king in Aram, right? A king in Aram. And it was not long after that this occurred. This apparently, maybe, I don't know, maybe a few decades at the most, but something like that. It just talks about the king of Aram. And this man, Naaman, he was a commander. And he had the authority. He had the ear of the king. He was the person in that army that was feared, by the way. Aram was one of the big guerrillas in that area. Have you heard of the language of Aramean? Heard of that? Aramean? That's some of the New Testament is written in Greek and some of it is in Aramean. Because Aramean had such an impact in that region that people spoke that language. That's how important that area was and how the influence that had spread to that area. So this guy who was in charge of the army, was he a big guy? Was he a big deal?
Yes.
He was. He was a big deal. So here is the most prestigious nation at this time, in this area, right? And the guy who's in charge of that army, of that most prestigious thing, is this guy here. He had a problem, though. He had leprosy. Okay, now, when the Bible uses the word leprosy, it doesn't mean necessarily Hansen's disease. I think that's what the correct definition of it is today. It's called Hansen's disease. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. But could have been any number of serious skin diseases that plagued that area that people could get. Many of them were fatal. Many of them were very slow acting, cancer type of things. We don't know for sure what it was, but if something was eating away at your flesh, causing digits to drop off and different things like that, was all under the category of leprosy. So did he have Hansen's disease? We don't know exactly, but he had a terrible disease. So you can see how important this man was, because guess what? The king didn't remove him from his position, did he? He still was the commander, right? He was still in place there. We're going to see what the king of Aram thinks of him when we start getting into our verses here. But anyway, I want to point out just really quick. Handout number 2 has a timeline for First and Second Kings. It gives us an idea of when some of these things happened. And I'm trying to, I should have wrote this down. They don't know exactly when it happened, because I don't see it in my list here. But you can go by a lot of times by the kings who were listed. And the king of Israel at this time was, I think, Jehoshaphat, or was it the guy after Jehoshaphat? I don't remember that part now. So if you look and see where Jehoshaphat makes his appearance, that would give you an idea also where we're at currently. Anyway, periodically Aram would go to war with Israel, and Israel would go to war with Aram, back and forth. So was there any love lost between these two groups, do you think?
Doesn't sound like it.
Doesn't sound like it, does it? What do you guys think? Would you love to have Aram as your neighbor? No, I don't think so. But they would periodically, and they'd go back and forth, give each other black eyes back and forth, And so they would raid each other's cities and take away the things they wanted, slaves was a big thing, any kind of crops they had or any kind of important things. So that's what was going on. Also, handout number 3 gives us a little more definition on some of the things here with the prophets and the priests and the kings of that time. And so, under prophets, I'm going to read that really quick. It says, during this period, Israel witnessed 3 types of prophets. The individual prophets, who confronted the sins of the kings and people, and the institutional prophets, who basically served as a yes man for the kings. And the prophetic guilds, called 12 times in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, the sons of the prophets. They were like a guild, a group of them. Independent prophets viewed institutional prophets as prophesying only what they thought the king wanted to hear. 1 Kings in chapter 22, 4 through 28 contains an excellent example of institutional prophets serving as yes men to the king. When Judah's king Jehoshaphat aligned with Israel's king Ahab to fight against Ramoth Gilead, the kings sought a prophetic confirmation for their mission. Dutifully, the 400 institutional prophets predicted success in the venture because they were unanimously favorable for the king. So you had to watch out for that. So these so-called prophets, I say, a lot of them, most of these people did these things for money. Those institutional type prophets we see, or the non, I call them the non-godly prophets. Balaam is a good example for that. Balaam was paid by a pagan king to go and prophesy against the children of Israel. Remember that? And then the donkey said, I'm not going down that trail. There's a guy with a sword who's going to chop me in pieces. And he told Balaam that. Anyway, quite an interesting story. But Balaam was a prophet for hire. But Elijah and Elisha were not those kind of prophets. They were the true prophets of God. So let's look at our first part here, and we're looking at the first one is in 2 Kings 5, 1 through 6, verses 1 through 6. And what I want you to do is listen for Naaman's desperate situation and how a young servant girl offered him hope. So, number 1. Who's got number 1?
I
Oh,
have number 1.
go ahead.
Now Naaman, captain of the army of the king of Aram, was a great man with his master and highly respected because by him the Lord had given victory to Aram. The man was also a valiant warrior, but he was a leper. Now the Arameans had gone out in bands and taken captive a little girl from the land of Israel, and she waited on Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, I wish that my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria. Then he would cure him of his leprosy. Naaman went and told his master, saying, Thus and thus told the girl who is from the land of Israel. The king of Aram said, Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. He departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, and 6,000 shekels of gold, 10 changes of clothes. He brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, And now, as this letter comes to you, behold, I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy.
So here's an interesting thing. This big gorilla, Aram, right? The big gorilla in the scene here, that a lot of the people are afraid of, the other nations are afraid of, is doing what? Having to do what? How about put their pride aside, maybe? Right? You ever heard of the term hat in hand? That's an old term. When you came hat in hand, you were basically taking your hat off to the person.
Being humbled.
You were humbled, right? So that's what's going on here. This is a very interesting thing to see. Normally, if you were in that position of Aram, you would just say, okay, send the army down there, get that guy, and take care of it, right? But that didn't happen this way. Didn't happen this way. And why wouldn't it have happened this way, do you think? Any thoughts?
God didn't want it to.
Well, that's exactly right. God didn't want it to, but we see how God took care of it beforehand. Remember? He had Elijah do what earlier? Appoint the king of Aram. Now that's an interesting thing. So this is probably in the background of this whole thing. We're not seeing all of the story of that part of the backstory, if you will. But the king of Aram realizes that that's the real prophet down there. We got to tread softly. We got to be careful. Now, did he really believe that, or he just was fearful of that? Probably just fearful of that, right? So he's not taking any chances, is basically what's going on here. And so we see they're basically taking hat in hand and going down to this little area of Israel to beg for the prophet to heal his army general. Now, I don't know about you, but the army general that's in charge of the group that's coming down and raiding me and stuff like this, I don't think I'd like him being there. You know, that's a dangerous situation too, isn't it? Now, we don't see how many troops came with this general. Probably enough to make people say, let's stay back. And probably the crack troops, right? But that's what happened. Another interesting thing here is that God allowed these raiding parties to Aram to come down and attack certain parts of Israel. Why did God allow that? It's all part of his plan, I think. Because we see one of these raiding parties did what? Captured an Israelite girl. A little girl. She was a slave girl. Okay, you understand what that means? She was at the lowest level of societal structures. When there was a mess to clean up, they called her in to do it. You know, that's what it comes down to. So she was a slave to the wife of Naaman. So we see an interesting thing here. The little girl said to her mistress, said to the wife, there's a real prophet. Now I'm using my transliteration here. There's a real prophet where I live. I wish that our master Naaman would go there. Now, if that's what's going on, you know this was a desperate situation, because the wife probably didn't have much stature either in the household, comparatively speaking. But she took an initiative. We don't hear this part. She took the initiative to do what? Go to her husband and say, you need to go to Israel and beg the prophet to heal you. So we see that happened also. And that was out of the ordinary. And then we see that Naaman did what? He went to his king. and begged for permission to go down there too. So was Naaman a desperate man?
He was willing to take the word of a servant girl.
Yeah, a slave.
And she must have thought fairly highly of him as well.
An interesting
You know?
thing, yeah. And this, Israel was not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They were supposed to be taking God to the world, and they didn't. So this is God taking initiative to say, okay, well, fine, then we'll do this. And guess what? God was presented to the world here, right? You see that. It's really neat to see how God worked in this. It's just amazing to me. And so this little girl had the spunk to stand up and speak these words. Speak these words to the wife, who spoke those words to her husband, who spoke those words to the king. Think of all those things like that had to happen. And so the king was really impressed because, again, in their background, they knew who Elijah was and how powerful he was and what he had done. And he came up and he appointed the king, one of the kings, maybe this king, maybe the king before that, we don't know exactly. So we see how those things are, and again, he went hat in hand. The king went hat in hand, essentially, to this prophet. Because what's he going to do? Is he going to force the prophet to do it? No, he's not, is he? He's going to bribe the prophet to do it. He's trying to pay him, right? Because look what are they taking down with them? 10 talents of silver, which was a lot of silver. 6,000 shekels of gold. And 10 changes of clothes. Now, when we see 10 changes of clothes, we don't think a lot about this, okay? But this was royal garments. This was the best. This was probably something like silk, the finest colors, all that stuff. And all that went with it. Probably the chains, and all the other ornaments that might go with it. Maybe even...
When the industrial age happened, textiles became much more affordable.
Yes.
So back then, textiles were extremely expensive.
Exactly right. You back in those days,
economics in some ways.
You're exactly right. They would keep the article of clothing that they had for their life. They would just continue to patch it and fix it and reweave it. So yes, clothing was a premium, and so this was an example though of the expense that is being sent down with this king to see him. And so we see this word is desperate. Were they all desperate to see Naaman healed? They were, weren't they? And I think that servant girl cared about her master. Isn't that an interesting thing to see? This slave girl cared enough to say, hey, and she could have been quiet. And what would have happened? He would have died. He would have died a horrible death, right? But he didn't want that to happen. So, are there some physical diseases and maladies and difficulties that people that get filled with dread when they get that diagnosis? What are some of the things that gives you pause if you were to get maybe a diagnosis of some terrible disease?
Anything to do with the big C.
Yes, cancer. Definitely. I had a relative, uncle who got that diagnosis, and he couldn't face it, and he shot himself. Terrible thing. Those things in life, and the sad thing about that particular case was they were just coming out with cures and stuff, but he didn't want to face it. There's lots of different things, though, we can get in life that would give us pause, right, and fill us with dread. So how do these things compare with the disease of Naaman? Well, I think the disease that Naaman had was pretty bad too. They had, if you ever do any study about this, these leper colonies they had back then, which if you got leprosy, you'd have to go off away from everybody, and they congregate in colonies or groups. And in the New Testament days, you're required to wear a bell or some sort of noise-making device and call out, leper, leper, so that people would be warned and go away from you.
But leprosy, just about any skin disease back then was labeled as
exactly
leprosy.
It could be skin cancer. It could be a lot of things. We don't think it was Hansen disease necessarily.
Could have been a really bad case of acne too.
But yeah. But anyway, that particular case is pretty much a death sentence back then because they didn't have any treatments for any of it.
No.
So if you got any kind of those kind of diseases, now you can be treated, but back then that was pretty much it. So it was a very dreadful disease. It's terrible. You would die a very slow death. Anybody here ever watch, what was it, Ben-Hur? Ben-Hur, you know, the hero of Ben-Hur goes to find his mother or something, or sister, and she's in a leper colony or something like that. You know, and they would lose digits, they would lose part of their face and things like that. It was a horrible way to die. So it was a dreadful thing. So Naaman would have been desperate to find relief, not only because of the medical challenges, you know, we talked about, but also because it caused him to be socially isolated. So how desperate was Naaman for a cure? He was willing to take the word of a slave girl and his wife, right? Who was told this by the slave girl. A female slave girl who happened to be a God-fearing Hebrew. How about that? You think God's hand was on that?
What's amazing, even with the leprosy, he was still maintained his position.
Yes. He was very good at what he did.
Yeah.
And he had the king's full confidence. Yes. And normally a person like that would have been removed from their office, but he was not. Anyway, it says under any other circumstances, even one of these attributes about what the slave girl and stuff would have caused Naaman to reject her advice. You know, they didn't listen to slaves; they were slaves, right? But interestingly, both the slave and the king were instrumental, and the wife, which kind of got left out of that part, but in moving Naaman towards the help he needed. So, how does God use relationships to offer hope in our most desperate times? Does He use those kind of situations in our lives? Does, doesn't He? He puts that right person there to comfort us, that right person to encourage us. Maybe that right person to help us see what we need to do to get cured. So God does those things in our lives when we're most desperate. God used the slave girl's faith. The slave girl's faith in God to draw Naaman closer to him, to God. So who was Naaman? He was this general, very powerful. He was a pagan. He was a follower of the god Nimrod, which pretty much all of Aram followed, their primary god. And so he's going hand in hand now to the prophet of God Almighty. So let's look at the next part here. The next part is directed. And we're going to look at verses 7 through 10. I want you to listen for the king's misunderstanding and the solution that Elisha offered. Now the king we're talking about is the king of Israel. Because remember what else the king of Aram did? He wrote a letter. This is very common, a letter of introduction. You know, here's the big giant group up there writing to the king down there, the smaller group, right? He says, he wrote this letter, and it said, I'm sending Naaman my servant to you that you may cure him of his leprosy. Think about that. You're the king, and you just got this letter. Let's read these verses. Go ahead.
Number 2,
Yeah.
2 Kings 5, 7 through 10.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, okay. When the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man is sending word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? But consider now and see how he is seeking a quarrel against me. It happened when Elijah, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent word to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots and stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. Elisha sent the messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean.
So here we go. Here comes Naaman with his entourage, right? And they're coming into town to where the king is. Whichever, I don't know where the king of Israel was at. I can't remember exactly his location here. It wasn't Jerusalem because that was Judah, right? We were talking about the northern kingdom of Israel. Also known as Samaria, by the way. That was another point that I need to make sure because the slave girl had told her mistress that there was a prophet in Samaria. And so Samaria is that same area we're talking about. Don't think it's a different area, it's the same area. But we see him come, right? And he brings this letter with him. And it's given to the king. And the king reads it. And he does what? Oh, isn't that nice? The guy's coming here so I can cure him of leprosy, right? Is he happy? No.
Because he knows there is no cure for leprosy.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but he is being personally asked to do it. You know, they didn't say, "Hey, can you take us to that prophet Elijah?" It says, "Here's my." This is the letter he's reading. "Here's my general. Please cure him now of his leprosy." So you would do what if you were the king of Israel? I'd do probably the same thing. What do you think? Go ahead.
Well, it's funny that the king of Israel would not automatically think of Elisha.
Yeah.
I mean, he's the prophet. The king would have known about him.
Yes.
Yeah.
He would have known about him, but did he like him? Did he appreciate him?
No.
And
not at
remember,
all, but-
they had their own group of prophets they're yes men prophets, right? They didn't usually bother with Elisha unless there's something really big going on, right?
And they really needed him.
And also, what did Elisha routinely do? He prophesied against his own people.
Yeah.
So he probably was persona non grata in the king's court. You know, we don't want Elisha around here. So he probably didn't. He knew there's no cure for leprosy. But he knew he couldn't do anything about it. So he did something that's very, very traditional.
Tore his clothes.
He tore his clothes. Now we talked about clothes before already. Clothes were precious. They were like taking a handful of silver coins and tossing them in the Jordan River. You know, it'd be that same kind of deal. So you're showing what? A public display of I am at a loss. I am in a situation where this big country up north of us is saying I got to do something that I cannot do. I am going to lose my life. Essentially what the king is thinking, right? So he tore his clothes to show his abject desperation of what the situation he feels that he's in. I can't cure this man. What is this guy doing? This king is doing, and he thinks he's doing this to somehow seek a quarrel against me. Because there's a lot of these kind of things back and forth. There's something called a false flag operation. You ever heard of that before? And it's a military term. False flag means something like, like Russia saying, "Oh, you're picking on the ethnic Russians. Ukrainians are picking on our ethnic Russians. We're going to go in and save them." Now, was there really that going on? Probably not. But it was an excuse to invade, right?
It's a made-up narrative to support their...
Yes. So when you hear the term false flag, that's what's going on. And he didn't say false flag here, but he's saying he's seeking to have a quarrel with me. It's the same idea. He's looking for a reason
to come and invade.
to invade. Yeah, that's what the king thinks. Oh my gosh, they're going to come down here and they're going to tear our nation up again, and I'm probably going to lose my life. So what? So Elijah heard of. Excuse me, I keep saying Elijah. Elijah's gone. He's in heaven now. Elisha heard this. This is really very interesting here. He heard this. Everyone heard this because it's a very public thing when you tear your clothes like this. It's a public demonstration of your situation, right? And the king is confused. He doesn't know what to do. He suspects a trap, right? But Elijah, he already knew, didn't he? Do you think he already knew? I think he already knew. Because remember, Elisha had a double portion. First of all, Elijah's spirit, you heard that, right? Mm-hmm. And he's in God's corner continually, right? The Holy Spirit was upon him, it says. And so he asked the king a question. He says, "Why have you torn your clothes?" Now let him come to me, that he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So again, by the time the little girl had said, "Hey, there's a prophet down in Samaria can cure you," ever play the game telephone? By the time the message got up the chain, the king of Aram is saying, "Oh, okay, the king down in Israel can cure him. Cure him." That's what's going on here. He didn't say, "Find that prophet and do it." But Elijah knew this was happening.
Because what the little girl said was, what?
There's a prophet
There's a
in
prophet.
Samaria.
Yeah.
In Samaria.
Exactly right. So here comes Elisha, and he has that confidence to come right before the king of Israel, right? And because he knows what's going on. So he tells him, "Send Naaman on down." So Elisha goes back home, right? And Naaman and his entourage, Just hear this rumbling sound. The chariots and all that stuff and his horsemen. They all come down and they stood at the doorway of Elisha. And Elisha comes up and bows before him and says, "What can I do for you?" Right?
Oh, no.
No!
This is an interesting part of the story. And
I love this part.
Yeah, because when we read the next part, it tells us a little bit more.
Uh-huh.
This is fun.
I like this part. Yep. It says Elijah sent a messenger to him. Now, somebody,
Go wash yourself, would you?
let's say, I don't know, the President of the United States comes because he heard something about you that he wants to hear from your lips, okay? So he comes to your door. Knock, 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 knock. And who's at the door? Oh, the President wants to come and talk to you. What's he want? Well, he wants to know where you did such and such or whatever. Well, just tell him it was over there. You're not going to go up and see the President?
Right? Shake his hand.
Shake his hand?
Show him a respect.
Depends
first.
what president, I guess. No, let's don't go there. But anyway, so there's a word for this.
The respect to the office.
Yes.
That's the respect to the general that could defeat you, right?
Yes.
This is what
Exactly
the
right.
parallel we're trying to draw here.
That's exactly right. He should, everybody would say, yes, Elijah should go there and bow down before him. What can I do for you, Elisha should bow down before him, right? And do whatever he wants right off the bat. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. And why do you think he doesn't do that? What could be the possible motivation for Elisha to answer this way? Or act this way? I personally think it's showing, it's trying to instruct Naaman, you need to have faith in God. It's not me. He was hoping that this prophet Elisha would come out and take his staff and make special signs and say special words.
Make it a big production.
Yes, because that's what they did with up in Aram with the god Nimrod, whatever his name was. I forgot where it was now. Anyway,
This is definitely a point of Elijah to, with the message sent the way it was to Naaman, understanding who he was in the pecking order, really.
exactly.
And that he needed to be humbled because he was unwilling to humble himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a lot of what was going on here.
Maybe Naaman expected him to come out and touch him, impart some sort of power.
Well, I think in the next section we can kind of get a glimpse of what he was expecting, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we
Absolutely.
do. We're getting, but he tells him to do something specific. What is it?
Wash himself 7 times in the Jordan.
In the Jordan River. Yeah. Now I was doing some YouTube checking on the Jordan and stuff like that, and I saw this one guy who went into the Jordan River. He dipped himself 7 times. I don't know what for. It's on there. You can look and find it. I don't think he got miraculously healed of leprosy, but whatever the case, basically they were replicating what happened to Naaman, I think. And in that particular thing, you could not see anything below the surface of that water. It has got to be the muddiest little spot I ever saw. Not a very big river. Certain times at flood stage, it's huge. It spreads out. But it's a meandering thing. It doesn't. It comes out of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Chimareth on our map here, and it meanders slowly down into the Dead Sea where it dies. So the Jordan River is not like the rivers out here. Anybody here been in North Fork of the Washougal River, for instance?
Yeah.
Many times.
Crystal clear, running.
You can see the fish.
You can see the fish, yeah. A lot of the rivers in the Northwest are that way. There are some that meander too, like the Shalis River does that and a few others. But a lot of the rivers that we have out here are really nice and clean and fresh and clear. This was not one of those kind of rivers. This was very muddy, probably stank, that kind of a thing. And that's what the river he wants him, this general of this big army, of a big nation, go dip it 7 times in our little local mud hole. Think about it. Think about that. You're this prestigious general, and that's what the prophet's telling you to do? Let's see what happens here. Let's look at the next part here. I think, Steve, you've got number 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, go wash in this 7 times in the Jordan River, and then you'll be restored. You'll be clean. And then...
But Naaman was enraged, and he went away and said, "Behold, I thought he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand all over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a furious rage.
So you can kind of understand this, can't you? Let's say it's as a general like George Patton or something with a lot of pride, and like I am hot stuff, or MacArthur. MacArthur is big that way too. There was a British general that was
What do you want me to do?
Yeah. You want me to bend my knee to you in this way? Wait a minute, you know who I am? You're telling me to go in that mud hole you call a river over there? You're not going to come out and see me?
It's more about obedience.
You're not going to go and say magic words and stuff? You're sending a messenger to tell me these things?
It's giving me
Yeah. So you can understand, if you put yourself in Naaman's shoes, who he is, his prestige, and what he's there to do, and all the gifts he brought, and all that stuff, and this is what the guy's doing to me. You can imagine why he would be enraged. Would you be enraged if you were Naaman? Possibly.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
we would like to think we'd do it differently, but think about it. If you were actually in the shoes of Naaman, who he was, you'd probably do it.
And knowing what he knows,
If not, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
He was limited in his knowledge. Had no idea who Elisha was.
Yeah.
He definitely wasn't the Roman soldier that came to Christ looking for healing for
No.
his servant.
He was not. He was not that person. Not yet. He wasn't that person yet.
Right, exactly.
But he had certain expectations, didn't he? He had certain expectations, and that wasn't it. That wasn't it. So he was enraged and went away, and he died a leper. No, didn't happen. No. But he did. He was complaining, didn't he? Man, I thought for sure he'd come out. I thought for sure he'd call upon his God, and he'd, do a sign over me and cure me. Oh, man, I am so disappointed. And besides that, I'm not going to stoop down and go into that muddy little thing they call a river out here. I got much better rivers up there. I got the North Fork of the Pharpar River, or whatever. All these places, right? Much better than this little thing they call a river down here. I could go and wash them and be clean just as well. So he turned and he went away, it says, in a furious rage. He was a general. And like a lot of generals, he had in mind what the plan was. And this was the plan. And it didn't go according to plan. What general here would love that kind of thing, being told what to do like this? None that I know of. Of all the successful generals, like I mentioned before, Patton, MacArthur, Schwarzkopf, there's one thing that marks them: ego and confidence. And this is the right way to do it. Let's go do it. Eisenhower. Now, yes, they took advice, and I'm not saying they didn't take advice and stuff like that. But for the most part, when they made a decision to do it, that was it. We're going to go in and do it. And you need people like that to fight wars. But this was not a war. This was something entirely different, and he was out of his element here. That's the primary thing to remember. Okay, we need to finish this. Get going here. So he went in a rage. I knew it was going to happen. And let's see, make sure. Well, there's something else I was going to say about that, and now I can't remember. But we often also have preconceptions, don't we, about how God ought to work, right? And maybe especially before we were saved, and what it means to. As far as being a Christian and stuff, and we found out differently when we became saved, didn't we? Found out differently. That's not how God operates. Can pride also stand in the way of us obeying God? Sure can it? Our pride is a big hindrance at times if we're not careful. Humility is one of those virtues as a Christians we need to cultivate. So anyway, feeling insulted and angry, Naaman left Elisha's house, ignored Elisha's instructions, that would bring him healing. Not a very smart thing to do. You'd think he'd be smarter than that. But again, he was thinking from his own culture, his own experiences. He was not thinking of how God actually operates, because he didn't know God, right? He did not know God. But an interesting thing happens here in the next few verses. I want you to listen to how Naaman's servants helped him move towards obedience to God's direction. And this interesting is, that God used those people who were closest to Naaman, first of all, to see that he should do this. Second of all, to follow that advice. You know, many times we see people that don't follow our advice, but this person, I think God was working in his heart to be tender-hearted towards this advice now from these people. In verse 13 and 14, delivered. This is the last point. It says, then his servants came near and spoke to him and said, my father. You can tell the respect here. They're using the word my father. This is the servants, right? My father, had the prophet told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, wash and be clean? So he went down. I bet you he was grumbling the whole time, by the way. And he dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan River, according to the word of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child when he was clean. And he was clean. So, yeah, I've heard this song about this. It was a gospel song, a spiritual, Negro spiritual or something, about Naaman going down, and first time and then nothing, and the second time nothing, the third time nothing, fourth time nothing. He's thinking, why am I doing this? The 5th time nothing, 6th time, why am I doing this? And oh, the last time, he comes up clean out of the water. What's this a picture of? Can we relate to this a little bit as Christians? This is a picture of baptism. Okay? Now, I know it's not exactly right. It's not the right formula, but it's showing that God can clean you. Only God can do it. And when we're baptized, that doesn't save us, but it's a reflection of what God did do. Right? So we see that picture here in a sense. And it's 7 times as significant because it's considered a whole number. And that's why you see that used a lot. So he went and he did it according to what the prophet said to do. And another thing is, that caught my attention here, if he had told you, Father, if he had told you to do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? In other words, go slay that dragon over there first, and then you'll be clean, right?
Do a mighty deed.
Yeah, do something I can do. I can earn it, right? Don't we all want to do that, though? Think about the cults, especially different cult groups. They all have things that you can earn your salvation. This is also reflected of what the gospel is going to talk about later on. You cannot earn your salvation. It's given by God. Given by God. And Elijah told him, God's going to give you this. You got to just do this simple thing the way God says.
Yeah, I know that 7, like you said, is considered the whole number, but it's interesting that it just wasn't, go dunk yourself in it and you'll be cured. You know, once, up, down, but no, 7 times.
Maybe he needed that.
He wanted to see how.
Yes, to complete it, to totally humble himself.
Yeah.
It wasn't the water that was magical or anything like that. Otherwise it would have been the first time, right?
Yeah.
It was God that
I mean, he could have did it in any river, for that matter of fact, a pool of water or whatever. But
Yep, exactly right. He could have, couldn't he?
see this mud hole here?
That's right. Anyway, so wrapping this up there because they did ring the bell. I mean, I have to finish. On the second page of our handout, this is the rest of the story. Like Paul Harvey, he used to have this thing called the rest of the story.
The rest of the story.
It says, when he returned to the man of God with all his company, and he came and he stood before him, he said, now behold, I now know there is no God in all the earth, but in Israel. So please, take a present from your servant now. But he, the prophet, said, as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will take nothing. And he urged him to take it. But Elisha refused. Naaman said, if not, please let your servant at least be given 2 mules load of earth. Now, who's a servant? That's him. He's referring to himself now as Elisha's servant. Interesting how we see a change has come to Naaman, don't we? 2 loads of earth for your servant, and who will no longer offer burnt offerings nor sacrifices to other gods, but to the Lord. In this matter may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, the pagan idol. And he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this matter. And he said to him, go in peace. And he departed from him some distance. And there's more to that also with Elisha's servant, by the way, who says, hey, wait, I'll take the little. We're not going to deal with that. But Naaman requests something interesting. Naaman requested 2 mules
And
packed with dirt, loaded with dirt. Well, that's an odd thing. Why would you think that? So the rest of the story here. Elisha understood Naaman's request and granted it without hesitation. He knew the request came from a sincere theological change in his heart. Naaman believed that there was no God in all the earth but in Israel. So he's not saying just Israel itself, by the way, but because he realizes there's only one God, is what the wording here is. And he wanted to return to his homeland with holy ground, even though he would still have to help his aged king bow down before the idol Rimmon. Naaman wanted Elisha to know that his heart belonged only to the God of Elisha.
Yeah, he lived in pagan culture, and he wanted some
Reminder.
a reminder, and then some forgiveness for
Right.
having to participate.
With
Yeah.
his king. And Elisha knew this, and he granted him that. It's kind of interesting. So we
It
have
is interesting.
a person now who's involved with worshiping God in charge of the army of Aram. Think about that. Isn't that incredible? That's incredible. Anyway, so 4 points real quick. God uses relationships to bring about his purposes. Second, Christians can view challenges as divine opportunities to show God's character. Third, our pride often gets in the way of experiencing God's help. That's true. And last, healing awaits those who obediently follow God's direction. Now, I should say healing, spiritual and physical, right? So our challenge from today's lesson is to take some time to examine these things maybe later and see how they relate to us, how we can turn ourselves towards God, what God wants for our life. Okay. So I also want you to think about how maybe you can build on that experience as you face future trials and challenges. Each of us will do that, right? All of us will do that. Like Naaman did, right? So let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Thank you, Lord, for this study of this very interesting miracle that Elisha did. And it was to turn that heart of that pagan general to you. Lord, help us in our own lives in these ways, Lord. Thank you for all you've done. Help us as we go through our lives and be with our pastor as he brings his message. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Thank you for being with us. This is Grace Baptist Church Adult One Bible Study. My name is Norm Ellis. Please stand by this YouTube channel. Pastor Matthew will be up next with the message. Thank you for joining us. I love this story.